Being patient with us. Will Aiken is on vacation this week, and he's usually the master producer behind this thing. So it turns out I need a lesson in Restream. So thank you for being with us today. Obviously, for those of you that are joining us, we are talking all about outbound messaging. So this is really about when you're selling to a buyer that you've never done the role of. It's really, really difficult to sometimes put yourself in their shoes. So to help us out with that and to give us an idea of how we get a better understanding of the buyer that we're selling to, we have a very, very special guest today. One of my absolute favorites in the sales space. He is a sales nerd just like me, and we're excited to pick his brain today. His name is JBay. He is the founder of Outbound Squad and truly one of my favorite people in the space. So Jason, welcome and thank you for being with us today.
I'm excited. There we go. We're working. We're here. My camera flipped out for a second. I was like, "Oh my god, another technical difficulty." We are good to go. And I have to say, you're handling it pretty well. I've definitely had freak out moments with webinars. I'm like, "Oh god, it's not working." So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, well, you heard me use my fair share of profanity in the last 5 minutes, so we're good. Awesome. So let's dig right in because I know we're behind. As we always do with these Lavender Lives, what is, if you have just one point to make on this show and this topic, what is the single most important thing you want our listeners to know about the topic of outbound messaging today?
Yeah, I think that it's a good question. I think that people get really prescriptive with, hey, if you look at the stats, Clearbit, Gong, both, it's like less than 2% success rates, whether through email or phone. So people get really prescriptive and they start looking for templates and hacks and like ways to write more clever emails and clever, how many cold calling opening lines have you heard these days? And I think the culprit, really like the root cause, if you will, of the problem is not that people don't know how to write emails or don't know how to have conversations with prospects on the phone. It's that they don't know what to say. And the reason for that, I don't know about, and maybe it's a little different in your case, Jen. Most of your experience is selling to sales leaders. If you come from sales, which people side point, it's not as easy as people think. It's actually harder in a lot of ways, I think. But most of the folks that we're selling to, a lot of you watching this, you're probably selling to people whose job you've never done before. And another layer of that is if you're an individual contributor and you've never had a leadership position before, and you're selling to someone that leads a department or leads a team of people, you're doing things and talking with people who you don't really know much about what they care about or what their day-to-day looks like. That's the problem. That right there, that's what's going to make your cold email better, what's going to make your cold call better, your LinkedIn messages, all that kind of stuff.
Love it. So let's dig into exactly how we do it. Now, recently you posted just a phenomenal post that was one of those ones where you're like, it's all the tactics. It's not just the talk. And you broke down 14 ways that if you're selling to a persona where you've never done the job, and I would argue, like, I've never been a sales leader, so I can't
Yeah.
really put myself in the shoes of a sales leader. So even if you're sales selling to sales, if you've never done the leadership job, I would say that still fits the category.
Totally.
Pick your top 5, let's say, in the interest of time, of things that you would recommend sellers do to get smart when you're selling to a persona that you've never held the job before.
Sure. So this one can be very difficult depending on what resources your company has. So I'll give you kind of my favorite go-to things that should work in just about every scenario. One of the most underrated things to do as either an SDR or an account executive, just to learn how to sell better, honestly, too, is to look at account executives, the top ones that meet with the personas you're trying to get meetings with, and look at their Gong or their Chorus or whatever recording tool that you're using. Like, actually go through and watch and look at the transcriptions. I can't tell you how many times, and this is the process I go through. And I work with a company. My goal is on day one that we train, I want to be able to pick up the phone and land an appointment for you guys. Like, that's my goal. So that's the very first thing I do is I want to hear recordings and look at transcripts. And typically you're going to find that the conversations on the sales side of the thing can really inform the outbound messaging. You're going to get way more detail and way more nuance around their priorities, their problems, how they're getting the job done, all of that kind of stuff. So recordings is a really, really good place to look. There's a couple other ones that are kind of interesting. And I'm looking at the list here because there's so many that it's hard to memorize. I think case studies can be really good. And what you might be thinking is, well, my company doesn't have great case studies. Look at your competitors' case studies. You can look at products that are sold to the same persona and look at those case studies too. And there are some companies out there that have excellent customer stories, case studies, that sort of stuff, where you can pull bits of language from that as well. And another thing, not that we want to go on a chat GPT tangent because I'm very skeptical of it, how people use it at least, but you could take a bunch of case studies, and if you're using the premium version or whatever, you can just throw website URLs in there and have it kind of pick and skim and detect patterns. Another one that's sort of less common is you could look at, if you have enterprise and strat sellers that put together really good business cases and they present those, or they have some sort of executive summary, there's a really, really good language in those. And I'll give you two more. One of them that I really like is, yeah, okay. So another competitor one that you can use that's really good too is if your competitors have, let's say that I'm selling conversational intelligence and I have to compete against Gong and Chorus, which sucks if that's the case. I'll throw Wingman in there too, like three really kind of big players. Look at the content that they post. Look at the people that review on G2, like pros and cons of their specific platform. And then lastly, another underrated one is look at the influencers that consult or create content or have podcasts or run webinars for your specific personas. The content that they create is going to have a lot of goodies in it. There's a bunch more that I can go into. I think those are kind of the best starting points in my opinion.
Yeah, and we'll link in the chat for those of you that are joining us on the event. We'll link to your post so folks can read the others. I want to double down on one you said and add one more. You said the comment around look at how your customers are actually positioning the business case internally. I remember the first time I saw what someone did with my presentation deck and how much they cut from it, how much they change from it, how they use much simpler language. And I was like, my gosh, this is the best lesson in understanding how to pitch. So I love, love, love that recommendation. Understand, what do our customers, our prospects do with what we give them? It's a phenomenal way to get smart on how they talk, how they speak. And then the other one I would add is look at events. Ask customers, what are events that you're going to? Who are you learning from? Basically put yourself in the shoes of learning like your buyer learns. And even one thing I'll do is I'll look at different conference agenda items, right? And say, what are the topics that people are literally flying in to talk about? And how do I relate back to those? Not try to change entirely, but what's my connective tissue between them? So I think just learning like your buyer learns, understanding where they go to learn, is another helpful way to add to the brilliant list you shared.
Yeah, I love all of that. The point that you made about them, people flying in to see those topics, like marketers put together the copy for that. It's really great stuff. One quick one I would add is, if you're a sales leader or if you're a rep, one thing you can get your sales leader to do is host a 20-30 minute fireside chat with the persona at your company that you're selling to. So if you sell to CISOs, get your CISO or your chief information officer, whatever, onto a fireside chat and talk about what it's like. The other thing that's really cool too, I do this all the time in trainings, is I share my screen and I open up my inbox.
Yes.
I'm one of those crazy people, Jen, that I take all of the cold emails that I get and I put them all into a folder and I say, look at these emails. And then I say, look at these emails compared to my promotions folder. You notice how they kind of look like promotional emails? Now let's look at my primary inbox, which is always kind of scary when you show that because there's something sensitive in there. But you see it, and it's like Will talks about this all the time. Lavender internal camouflage. So I look at the primary inbox, and it's like 3 to 5 word subject lines. Not everything's capitalized. It doesn't say "Dear Jason" at the beginning. It's got really good like observational type of stuff that you can look at, and you can get an idea of what it's like to be your buyer and to be on the receiving end of all of the cold outreach that they get.
I love, love, love that. There's no better way to really understand how your buyer speaks and thinks. And also Dayton, thank you for chiming in on the chat. I love this recommendation. Look at the job career posts, understand what they talk about as it relates to the role. Everybody's a little bit different. So it's a great way to get specific. So now you've got a better understanding of the persona at large. One of the things I really like that you talk about is how to balance your understanding of the persona, but also get a deeper understanding of that prospect as an individual. Now, I think everybody on this line knows we're not supposed to be asking obvious questions that we can find answers to on the internet. But one thing I think newer sellers often struggle with is how do you actually get a prospect to open up? So you talk about the disclosure principle. What is that? How do you use it?
Yeah, let's ignore Will Aiken in the chat. He's giving you some grief,
I'm
Jen.
I'm putting it
We're
up
not
here.
we're not gonna acknowledge
He's
him,
not
nothing.
wrong.
Um, so, self-disclosure principle works like this in a nutshell. So I have a therapist. His name is Sam. I don't know anything about Sam's life, and he knows everything about my life besides my wife, Sarah. And I feel extremely close to him because I've shared all of this stuff about myself. And the self-disclosure principle in sales, the way that it works is if I can get prospects talking about themselves, they will feel more of a connection with me. They'll feel more of a rapport and they'll want to talk about themselves. So the key is not to ask lots of questions and do all this other kind of stuff. It's to make the focus of your messaging, whether phone or email, make the focus of the content about the other person and their world. So it's the difference between saying, at Outbound Squad, Jen, I was giving you a call because we provide sales training for some cool companies like Medallia, Gong, et cetera. I wanted to set aside some time with you to talk about how we can help your AEs self-source more pipeline. Click, right? It's like, no, don't want to talk about that. But if I said, Jen, I talked to a lot of sales leaders and specifically at companies like Gong and Medallia, what we're hearing is one, a big priority around AE self-sourcing. So getting to 30% self-source pipeline to get 4 to 5x pipeline coverage. The other thing that we're hearing is, really a focus around running tighter deals. So how do we multi-thread? Because we're having to interact with CFOs and buyers we've never had to interact with before, and deals are taking longer to close, smaller, et cetera. I'm really curious, how does that align with what you're working on right now? And I've talked about what we do through the lens of the buyer. So I've heard this referred to as customer voice, which I like. So I talk about you and people like you. That's going to get you talking about yourself. And that's the key with prospecting is don't prospect to make a sale, prospect to start a conversation. So the way that I get people to talk about themselves is to talk about them.
Okay, so I love this because one of the classic unhelpful pieces of sales advice we've all heard before is build trust and credibility. Like it's some box that we check. And I think when I listened and put myself in the shoes of a buyer, when I heard you, the thing that rang through that entire pitch that you just did was trust and credibility, right? You are earning trust not by saying I work with Gong and I work with Medallia, but by using them as an example to show I have experience in this space, but I'm not just throwing logos out at a wall hoping that is impressive to you. I'm
Yeah.
throwing logos out to show I've gotten an intimate understanding of what is typically a priority or what's difficult. So I love that example because I think it really does a nice job of not leading with us, but still demonstrating the expertise in the space. Now, one of the things you've talked to me about that I thought was really, really an interesting take is that you shared that a lot of times sellers will kind of lead that discussion with problems. And your take is that it should be priority led. So talk to us about that. Why do you think like that? What does that sound like?
I mean, when you think about it, it's kind of common sense when you think about it. And that's kind of the area of sales that I live in is the stuff that's like so obvious that you don't think about it. You know what I mean? And this is one of those things where it's like, if someone in your personal life, imagine our Jen, when we first met, which was not too long ago, our first conversation, I said, Jen, so tell me about your biggest problems right now. You're going to be like, who are you, dude? Like, you're like basically a stranger to me. Like, I don't know you. Um, you just got married, right? You were talking about that. Imagine it's like, hey, tell me about all the problems that you're having and like planning this wedding. You're like, dude, it's just weird. So if you call an executive, Ethan on my team, what he talks about this as, when you open up with problems, you're basically getting someone to lower their status to a complete stranger. So that's not a good thing to do. So what you want to do is, especially in a cold call, let's say, is I want to assume that you don't have this problem and that you've already figured it out. That's my language. So like what I can do is like with AE self-sourcing, for example, if someone's like, yeah, it's definitely focused. Who are you? What do you do? Oh, again, Jason with Outbound Squad. I was giving you a call about that. I hear that from a lot of sales leaders, by the way. And one of the issues sometimes that they run into, and you might already have this figured out, is that they tell their AEs to go prospect. They talk about it a lot, but they don't really provide a lot of enablement. So what they're finding is that the AEs are kind of rusty and they actually need some enablement around frameworks, email frameworks, cold calling talk tracks. Like they kind of need to be retrained all over again. I'm really curious, how does that like resonate with you? What are you seeing with your account executives? Are you able to get them prospecting right now? And it's like the way that I ask that is I'm not being assumptive that you have the problem. And if I lead with the priority and the thing that you're focused on, that's what executives, in my opinion and experience at least, really care about is they're very aspirational. Like an SVP, like the SVPs that I work with, or the VPs of sales, they're not like waking up thinking about all the problems that they need to fix that day. They're kind of thinking about like, where do we need to be in 6, 12 plus months? And are we on track to do that? And how can I find more people to partner with that can get me on the right path? Not how do I fix this painful problem right now? That's usually uncovered later. So when we open up with problems, I think below the line buyers, you can get really, if I was talking to a sales manager, I might be like, hey, getting your A's to prospect, right? Pretty tough. What have you tried? Because I'm sure you're giving them templates. You're talking about it in a one-on-ones. Nothing's working. Like, tell me what you're going through. What's it like for you on a weekly basis? That's a way different conversation, and not someone I want to get a sales cycle started with. That's a way different conversation than an above the line buyer up here. So there's like so much to unpack there. But if I had to like kind of quickly summarize that, it's always start with what people want to accomplish and priorities you typically align to when you're selling your solution. Start with that and then work your way into the problems.
Okay, so there's two things that I absolutely love about this, and I will say this is a place you have absolutely shifted my thinking in this topic, and I love
Oh,
it.
really?
So
That makes me
one
feel good, Jen. Because, I
with
think
all
I'm
the warm
good in
and
a lot of
fuzzies.
ways in this area. Yeah.
So one thing is the subtle drop in of, and you might already have figured this out, right? It has none of the desperation that we often don't realize our tonality delivers of trying to paint our problem as the biggest problem. Like I love that because now you've primed me to disagree with you. And I think that is like, that's what our prospects are normed to do anyway. So I love the subtle drop of that. It makes it sound the difference between a vendor and someone who's a professional. And then the second thing I love about what you did is the specificity of the problem. One of the traps I fell into so many times when I was selling is I would be calling and saying, like, you're probably trying to grow in a really difficult market right now. Well, no shit. Everybody's trying to do that. And it's just so it means nothing, right? But you
Yeah.
talk specifically about AE's self-sourcing pipeline. That is either going to sound the alarm bells or it's not. And if it doesn't, great. Now I've just disqualified a prospect who doesn't have the problem that I solved for. So those two things stand out as being, by and large, two things I think are very rare, uncommon, but also highly effective in just establishing a tonality and a presence with someone that maybe you're less comfortable selling to.
Yes. Quick comment on that is, and I hear this all the time. Well, every buyer I talk to is different. They're not, dude. They're not. Like 80% of the people that you speak with on a regular basis, they have a pattern of like two or three things, assuming that we're segmented and niche down enough. But every sales executive I talk to in SaaS that's got a team of like 50 to 500 people is working literally almost on the same exact thing right now. So like you have to find those patterns, and then what you can do with tools like Lavender that's really cool is like not to plug you guys too hard. Is it's like you take those two or three common priorities like AE self-sourcing, and then I look for things at that company that would indicate that that might be a focus. They're hiring account executives, but not hiring SDRs. The AE to SDR ratio is really low, right? Or really high, one or the other. There's not a lot of SDRs supporting the AE, right? So you can look for cues like that to support that this priority that's very common applies to that company. So that's kind of like the relevance piece is the priorities. The personalization piece, in my opinion, it's not the college they went to or anything like that. That's the custom parts you add that are specific for their company and for the individual that like lead into that priority.
So, I could spend another 30 minutes with you just on that topic. The way you broke that down, I'm totally obsessed with, because when we see those emails that start with like noticed X, a lot of times that is a flawed play because we're like, noticed you got funding. But when you say something like, notice the ratio of AEs to SDRs is lower than I typically see, got me thinking, maybe this is a thing. What you're essentially doing is you're expressing, I'm giving you significant thought. I'm not just picking you because you're a big logo, you've got a lot of like salespeople or employees or some other demographic thing. I'm picking you because I've put concrete thought behind it. You're most thinking out loud. And I think buyers appreciate that because they recognize that's not something you're doing en masse. So I love that. Okay, one last question with the time that we have. And again, I could talk your ear off all day. So, one of the other things you raised with me I thought was interesting as well is this whole notion of talk time. So, I think for any of us who have been newer to selling, we all know we probably talk too much because we're nervous and we just are trying to say as much and hope something sticks. But what's your take on talk time that I think is kind of unconventional?
Yeah. Let me know in the chat. Write me in the chat if you've ever gotten this advice. You have two ears and one mouth. Use them proportionately. And like when I hear that, I'm like, I take that pretty literal. I'm like, so I talk a third of the time. They talk two-thirds of the time. And I don't know about you. That's like I'm an introvert. That would be an ideal scenario for me. But I also think about when I'm in a like sales process and there's groups of like buyers and things like that. Like I need to lead the interactions and the conversations. That usually requires you to do a lot of driving and talking. So the common misconception is that people think in a cold call, the data actually shows with like sales calls too. Challenger has some really good data on this too, that you actually talk more. The successful reps talk more than their buyer. And it's not a lot more. It's like 55-45 rep to prospect. But it's not about talking less than the prospect. It's about talking about yourself less. So the content of the conversation is way more important than talk time. Even if I only talk 20% of the time, but it was just pitching what I do, obviously, I think we would all agree here that that would be really bad. So it's not about how long you're talking. Focus more on the content and making the conversation about the other person and their
That
organization and all that other good stuff.
That line, "You're not talking less, you're talking about yourself less," I think should be just brazened on everybody's laptop because I think that's the nuance that I think some of us get wrong from time to time. So before we wrap up, feel free to put questions in the chat if there's anything you wanna, ask Jason. But as we wrap up, Jason, I guess, is there anything else as it relates to outbound messaging you think we didn't cover today that's important for folks that are obviously selling into a newer persona?
Oh God, so much. Uh, I want to double down on that. Don't prospect to make a sale, prospect to start a conversation. I want you to change your goal when you're prospecting to just like, instead of conversions, like getting meetings and all this stuff, I want you to think about how do we start conversations? So when I send an email, if I were to reverse engineer, this is an exercise I have people do. I say, before we write an email, what I want you to do is write down ideally how you think the prospect would respond. Sure, let's chat. Let's take a meeting. This sounds interesting. Okay, well, how do you reverse engineer getting that reply? And when you look at your email, oftentimes you look at it, it's like you're asking two or three different things, and it's like not really clear what you're asking for. And like just really think about, does the outreach that I'm sending through email or the conversations that I open with on a cold call, are they starting conversations or am I just going for the meeting? So approach it as a conversation, and you'll find that a lot of those conversations end up turning into meetings. But you need to kind of like, people can smell it's in Super Troopers, they had this line, it was desperation's a stinky cologne. So like people can smell and sense desperation. So don't go in wanting to like need anything from someone. Go in wanting to start a conversation and being totally okay if the other person doesn't want to talk to you, because let's face it, you're calling them and they didn't ask you to call them. So we have to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The tonality of that matters so much. So I know we're at the 30-minute mark. Jason, do you have a minute to stay on to answer a question? If you don't, we can wrap it up and connect afterwards.
I could do 2 minutes. I can answer
Okay.
one
That's
question.
got a great question. So how do you train that muscle of specific insight into the industry, going from saw funding to noticed your AE to BDR ratio?
Okay, so my advice if you're an SDR is what you don't have that your AE counterparts have a head start on you on is business acumen. Because you haven't done the sales calls, you don't kind of understand how decisions get made inside of an organization. And I think that's what teams could spend way more time training reps on is not just the buyer's journey, like awareness, consideration, all this other stuff. It's like, hey, when a buyer becomes aware of a problem, what happens? And you talk about this a lot. Well, there's a consensus that needs to be made internally of some sort. So no one says we have this problem and we need to invest $100,000 in Jason's training to go train our team. They say, hey, who else? Anyone else think that we have a problem? Because like I don't want to do this alone. And then they think, oh, well, shit, we have a lot of problems. Is this important for us to fix? Like, so as an SDR, you need to like spend a lot of time with the best account executives to understand what your buyer does after the meeting. And I forgot
Nope.
exactly what the question was. So for account executives, this would be a muscle memory. So for account executives, I want you to think about outbound and selling. Yes, they're two totally different things. One is more of a marketing activity. One is like a selling type of thing, but they are more similar than they are dissimilar. And what I mean by that is do outbound and like keep in mind what's going to happen after that. Keep in mind that like if I get this meeting here, like what would make this person want to chat with me now that like makes sense with a conversation that we might have later around discovery or a demo that I might show them or other people that they might get involved. Like those two things are very similar. So as an account executive, don't think like, oh, I'm doing outbound, I'm sending messages. No, I'm looking for people that it would be a good idea to start a potential buying conversation with.
Love it. Love it.
So
Okay.
that's big.
I know you've got to run. So thank you so much for being with us today. Before you hop off, where can people keep learning from you? Because I know they're going to want to.
Yeah, outboundsquad.com is our main kind of hub. So we have a podcast there. LinkedIn, I post free content just about every weekday. And then we also do training and coaching and all that kind of stuff for both individuals and teams. So if you're wanting any help with this topic that we talked about, we talk a lot about multi-threading, discovery, demos, that sort of stuff. Outboundsquad.com is the best place to go.
Love it. If you're not following Jason, smash that follow button. He is an incredible, incredible leader in the space. Jason, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone that joined us, for bearing with me and my inability to figure out tech. We will see you next week. Thanks, all.
And